The air inside the concrete bunker on Iwo Jima tasted like volcanic ash and fear. It was the morning of February 23rd, 1945, and Private First Class Yamamoto Kenji had not seen daylight in 4 days. Through the narrow firing slit, he could see black sand, the twisted remains of American landing craft and bodies. So many bodies they had stopped counting after the first 100. His position, dug 15 feet into the volcanic rock and reinforced with steel rails salvaged from demolished buildings, had withstood 3 days of naval bombardment. The walls were 3 feet thick. The entrance was protected by a sharp angle that prevented direct fire. By every principle of defensive engineering he had been taught, this position was impregnable. Then he heard a sound he had never heard before. A mechanical roar followed by a liquid rushing, like a waterfall made of fire. The bunker's temperature rose 10 degrees in seconds. Orange light flickered against the concrete walls, and Yamamoto smelled something sweet and chemical, mixed with burning flesh from somewhere outside. Another Marine squad had just discovered what the Americans had been developing in laboratories at Harvard University, while Japanese engineers had been perfecting the art of underground fortification. The weapon approaching Yamamoto's position could project a stream of jellied gasoline, a substance that would soon be known universally as napalm, across distances that rendered every defensive calculation obsolete. The mixture burned at over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. It clung to whatever it touched, and it could turn the corner into his bunker's angled entrance, flowing like liquid death around the very obstacles designed to stop it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yamamoto's training had been thorough, brutal, and absolute. For 6 months before his deployment to Iwo Jima, he had lived in a replica defensive position constructed in the hills outside Yokohama. The instructors had been veterans of the China campaign, men whose eyes carried the weight of years spent in continental warfare. They taught him that the bunker was more than shelter. It was a philosophy made concrete. "The Americans have machines," his commanding officer had said during a lecture in December of 1944. "They have bombs and shells and endless ammunition. But machines cannot dig. Machines cannot hide. Underground, we become invisible. Underground, we become invincible." The doctrine was not mere propaganda. It was rooted in hard-won experience and mathematical reality. Japanese defensive positions on islands like Tarawa and Peleliu had exacted devastating casualties on American forces. On Tarawa alone, in November of 1943, the U.S. Marines suffered over 3,000 casualties in just 76 hours of fighting. The island's defenders, dug into hardened positions, had held out against naval bombardment that pulverized the surface but left the subterranean fortifications largely intact. The lesson was clear. Depth equaled survival. Concealment equaled victory, or at least the ability to sell each yard of ground at a price the Americans might not be willing to pay. Yamamoto had absorbed these lessons with the intensity of a young man who understood his survival depended on them. He learned to identify weak points in overhead cover, to calculate angles of deflection for incoming artillery, to estimate how many feet of earth and concrete would be needed to withstand a 500-pound bomb. The mathematics were precise. American bombs penetrated soil at predictable rates based on velocity and angle of impact. A properly constructed position, set back from the beach with overlapping fields of fire and multiple escape tunnels, could theoretically withstand anything short of a direct hit from battleship guns, and even those could be survived if you dug deep enough. What his instructors never mentioned, because they themselves did not yet know, was that American chemical engineers had been working on a problem that had nothing to do with explosive force or penetrating power. They were not trying to dig deeper or hit harder. They were trying to make fire flow. The concept of the flamethrower was not new. Both sides had experimented with fire weapons since the First World War. The Germans had deployed crude versions in the trenches of France, and the Italians had used them in Ethiopia. But these early devices were limited by a fundamental problem. Gasoline does not throw well. In its liquid form, fuel breaks apart into droplets almost immediately when sprayed under pressure. The stream loses coherence after 30 or 40 feet. The operator has to get dangerously close to the target, and the weapon's effectiveness depends entirely on the fuel actually entering the fortification, something that protective angles and blast walls were specifically designed to prevent. In 1942, the U.S. War Department contacted Harvard University's chemistry department with a simple question: could they make gasoline sticky? The request went to a team led by Louis Fieser, a brilliant chemist whose previous work had focused on synthesizing anti-malarial drugs and studying carcinogenic compounds. Fieser understood immediately what the military needed. If you could thicken gasoline to the consistency of syrup or jelly, it would maintain stream coherence over much greater distances. It would stick to surfaces rather than splashing off, and most importantly, it would burn longer and hotter than raw gasoline, because the thickening agents would slow the combustion rate while maintaining temperatures high enough to melt steel. The solution Fieser's team developed was elegantly simple and horrifyingly effective. They mixed gasoline with naphthalene and palmitate, both readily available industrial chemicals. The naphthalene came from coal tar, a waste product of steel production. The palmitate came from palm oil and coconut oil, which American forces controlled in abundance after securing supply lines from the Pacific. When mixed in the correct proportions, these chemicals transformed gasoline into a gel that had the texture of petroleum jelly, but the combustive properties of an incendiary bomb. The military gave it a name derived from its chemical components: napalm. The first batches were produced in early 1943. Initial tests were conducted at dugouts and bunkers constructed at military testing grounds in Maryland and Virginia. Engineers built replica Japanese fortifications based on intelligence gathered from captured positions, complete with angled entrances, firing slits, and reinforced walls. Then they tried to destroy them with conventional weapons to establish a baseline. High explosive shells collapsed some structures but left others intact. Small arms fire was useless. Even satchel charges placed at the entrance often failed to neutralize defenders positioned deep inside the bunker. Then they tested the new napalm mixture in a modified M1A1 flamethrower. The results exceeded every expectation. The jellied fuel shot from the weapon's nozzle in a coherent stream that reached over 100 feet, more than twice the range of gasoline alone. When it struck the bunker entrance, it did not splash back. It flowed forward, following the contours of the angled passage, sticking to walls and ceiling, burning with such intensity that the air temperature inside the fortification rose to lethal levels within seconds. Defenders who were not directly touched by the flames died from heat exposure or asphyxiation as the fire consumed all available oxygen. The weapon was approved for combat deployment in the Pacific Theater in mid-1943. The first operational units were trained at Camp Pendleton in California, where volunteer Marines learned to operate the 43-pound weapon that would redefine infantry combat. The M22 flamethrower, as the production model was designated, consisted of 4 main components: 2 cylindrical fuel tanks worn on the back like a large pack, a pressurized nitrogen tank to provide propulsion, a rubber hose connecting the tanks to the wand, and the ignition wand itself with its distinctive nozzle and pilot light system. Each fuel tank held 2 gallons of napalm mixture. At maximum pressure, the weapon could fire a continuous stream for 10 seconds, or be operated in shorter bursts that extended ammunition over a longer engagement. The effective range was listed officially as 100 feet, but experienced operators knew they could push it to 150 feet in favorable conditions. No wind, slight downward angle, fresh fuel mixture. The stream traveled at roughly 60 miles per hour, fast enough that defenders had almost no reaction time between seeing the flame and feeling its impact. But these were just specifications, numbers on a training manual. Yamamoto knew nothing of Harvard chemists or Camp Pendleton training programs. What he knew was the layout of his bunker, the thickness of its walls, and the absolute certainty his instructors had conveyed that underground positions were the answer to American material superiority. On the transport ship from Japan to Iwo Jima, in January of 1945, his company commander had gathered the men on deck for a final briefing. The officer was a veteran of Saipan, one of the few who had escaped that island's fall 6 months earlier. "The Americans believe they can defeat us with machines," the commander said, his voice carrying over the sound of the ship's engines. "They believe their tanks and planes make them invincible. But on Saipan, we learned that machines are useless against an enemy they cannot see. Our defenses on Iwo Jima are stronger than anything built on Saipan. We have had months to prepare. Every bunker is connected by tunnels. Every position has multiple escape routes. The Americans will land on the beaches and find nothing but empty sand and hidden guns. And when they come looking for us underground, they will discover that their machines cannot follow them into the earth." The men had believed him because they had no reason not to. The logic was sound. The examples were real. And the alternative, accepting that their defensive positions might not be enough, was unthinkable for soldiers who understood they were being sent to hold an island that could not be reinforced and would never be relieved. Iwo Jima's geography made it a perfect fortress if you were willing to go deep enough. The island was only 8 square miles, a volcanic rock rising from the Pacific with Mount Suribachi dominating the southern tip and a plateau of broken lava fields covering the rest. But beneath that surface lay miles of tunnels carved from soft volcanic rock. The Japanese garrison, numbering over 20,000 men, had spent months creating an underground city. Command posts were buried 40 feet down. Ammunition depots were blasted into solid rock and reinforced with concrete. Barracks, hospitals, and supply rooms existed in a shadowy world where men lived for weeks without seeing the sun. The defensive positions facing the beaches were the outer edge of this network. Each bunker was positioned to cover specific zones with interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun nests were hardened against aerial bombardment. Artillery pieces were mounted on tracks so they could be rolled out to fire and then withdrawn into caves before counter-battery fire could locate them. And everywhere, in hundreds of positions scattered across the island, infantry squads like Yamamoto's waited in concrete boxes designed to survive anything the American military could throw at them. The invasion began on the morning of February 19th, 1945. For 3 days before the landing, American battleships and cruisers had pounded the island with the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment of the Pacific War. The warships fired over 40,000 shells. Carrier aircraft dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. The volcanic rock shook with each impact, and the air filled with dust that turned day into twilight. Inside his bunker, Yamamoto felt the vibrations through the concrete floor but remained unshaken. The position held, the walls held, the math held. Then the first Marines came ashore, and the killing began. From his firing slit, Yamamoto could see them struggling up the volcanic sand beach, weighed down by equipment, exposed to gunfire from positions they could not locate. His bunker's machine gun opened fire at predetermined intervals, sweeping assigned sectors, then falling silent to avoid drawing counterfire. This was the doctrine in action: shoot and hide, kill and survive. The Marines kept coming. They always kept coming. But the cost was measurable in bodies scattered across the beach. For the first 2 days, the system worked. American forces pushed inland, but at a terrible price. Every yard gained required clearing bunkers that did not appear on any map and could not be spotted until Marines were close enough to draw fire. Tank attacks bogged down in the soft sand. Artillery barrages pulverized empty ground while the defenders waited underground. Yamamoto's position repelled 3 separate assaults. The Americans tried grenades down the firing slit, useless against the inner blast wall. They tried satchel charges at the entrance. The angled passage deflected most of the explosive force. They tried suppressing fire from tanks. The rounds sparked off concrete and buried themselves in volcanic rock. Then, on the afternoon of February 22nd, something changed. Yamamoto was eating his rice ration, cold, because fires were forbidden during daylight, when he heard one of his squad mates shout from the forward position. Not a warning, not an order. Just a sound of pure confusion. He moved to the firing slit and looked out at the battlefield. 200 yards away, a Marine was approaching a bunker similar to Yamamoto's own position, but this Marine was not carrying a rifle or a satchel charge. He was carrying something on his back, 2 cylindrical tanks connected to a wand he held in front of his body like a bizarre mechanical appendage. As Yamamoto watched, the Marine stopped about 70 feet from the bunker entrance and raised the wand. There was a crack of ignition, and then fire leaped forward in a stream that did not arc or fade or break apart. It shot straight from the nozzle to the bunker entrance, as if gravity and air resistance had ceased to apply. The stream hit the opening and disappeared inside. For perhaps 2 seconds, nothing visible happened. Then smoke began pouring from the firing slits. Thick black smoke mixed with something that shimmered in, the heat. A moment later, 2 Japanese soldiers stumbled out of the rear entrance, their uniforms smoking, their hands clutched to their throats. They made it perhaps 10 yards before collapsing. Yamamoto stepped back from the firing slit. His hands were shaking. He had seen death before. He had participated in it, had fired the machine gun that cut down Marines on the beach. But this was different. This was not bullets or shrapnel or explosive force. This was fire that traveled like a liquid and penetrated like a gas. Fire that ignored concrete and bypassed blast walls and found you in the darkness where you thought you were safe. "What was that?" one of his squadmates asked. His voice pitched higher than normal. "American weapon," Yamamoto replied, because that much was obvious. But the fuller answer, what kind of weapon, how it worked, what it meant for their survival, those answers he did not have. Not yet. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The weapon Yamamoto had just witnessed was being wielded by Private First Class Richard Klages of the 4th Marine Division. Klages had volunteered for flamethrower duty during training at Camp Pendleton, a decision that puzzled his fellow Marines. The weapon was heavy, dangerous to the operator, and marked its user as a priority target for every enemy soldier within rifle range. Japanese snipers specifically targeted flamethrower operators because disabling the weapon required only one well-placed shot to the fuel tanks, a shot that would turn the operator into a human torch. But Klages understood something his skeptical colleagues would learn during combat. The flamethrower was the only weapon that could reliably neutralize fortified positions without requiring close-quarters combat. A rifleman had to get within grenade range to attack a bunker, exposing himself to defensive fire for the entire approach. A satchel charge operator had to reach the entrance itself, place the explosive, and retreat before detonation, all while under fire from multiple positions. The flamethrower operator could stand 70 feet back, beyond the effective range of defensive grenades, and pour fire directly into the position with almost perfect certainty of success. Clagus had received 6 weeks of specialized training with the M22 flamethrower. The instruction covered mechanical operation, tactical employment, safety protocols, and the specific techniques needed to attack different types of fortifications. He learned to identify bunker entrances by the patterns of disturbed earth and the angles of firing slits. He learned to approach from oblique angles that minimized his exposure to defensive fire. He learned to fire in short bursts that conserved fuel while maintaining psychological pressure on defenders. And he learned what the fuel would do to human beings when it found them in enclosed spaces. The training instructors did not romanticize the weapon's effects. They described them clinically, factually, because every operator needed to understand what he was inflicting and be capable of inflicting it repeatedly. Napalm burned at temperatures that caused fatal burns in seconds. The jellied mixture stuck to skin and uniform fabric, continuing to burn even if the initial stream had moved on. In enclosed spaces, the fire consumed oxygen faster than defenders could breathe, causing asphyxiation before the flames themselves made contact. And if defenders fled their positions, they emerged disoriented and exposed, easy targets for supporting infantry. "You will be feared," the chief instructor had told Clagus's training company. "The enemy will learn what this weapon does, and they will fear it more than artillery, more than bombs, more than naval gunfire, because those weapons might miss. This weapon does not miss. If you can see the opening, you can fill it with fire. Remember that when you are carrying 43 pounds on your back and Japanese rifles are aiming at your fuel tanks, remember that you are carrying the weapon that makes bunkers obsolete." On Iwo Jima, those words proved accurate in ways that exceeded even the instructor's expectations. The island's volcanic rock, so perfect for carving defensive tunnels, had properties that amplified the flamethrower's effectiveness. The rough surfaces inside bunkers and caves provided maximum surface area for napalm to cling to. The confined spaces prevented heat dissipation, turning each fortification into an oven. And the interconnected tunnel networks that were supposed to provide escape routes instead became channels for spreading fire and smoke from one position to another. Clagus's first bunker attack on Iwo Jima occurred on February 21st, his third day on the island. His squad had been pinned down for 40 minutes by machine gun fire from a position that could not be flanked or suppressed. The bunker was positioned in a natural depression with clear sight lines in 3 directions. Grenades thrown at the firing slit bounced back down the slope. A bazooka round hit the concrete facing and accomplished nothing but alerting every Japanese position in the area to the squad's location. The squad leader, a sergeant from Oklahoma named Harrison, crawled back to where Clagus was sheltering behind a destroyed landing vehicle. "Think you can reach it?" Harrison asked, pointing at the bunker with his chin. Clagus studied the position. 75 yards away, slight upward angle, no wind. "Yeah," he said. "I can reach it." "Then do it before they kill us all." Clagus moved to the right flank where volcanic boulders provided intermittent cover. The 43 pounds of gear on his back felt like twice that weight in the volcanic sand. He could hear the machine gun firing in controlled bursts, disciplined and deadly. The Japanese gunner was good, experienced, probably a veteran, which meant he would know what a flamethrower operator looked like, and would shift fire the moment Clagus exposed himself. There was no clever solution. Clagus simply stood up, brought the wand to firing position, and pulled the trigger before the machine gun could traverse to him. The striker wheel sparked against the pilot light, and jellied gasoline erupted from the nozzle in a stream that looked solid in the afternoon sun. It covered the distance to the bunker in less than 2 seconds, and poured through the firing slit like water through a funnel. The machine gun stopped immediately. Klages held the trigger for a 3 count, then released. The napalm continued burning inside the bunker, visible as an orange glow through gaps in the structure. No one emerged. After 30 seconds, smoke began rising from the rear entrance. Harrison led the squad forward, rifles ready, but there was nothing left to fight. The bunker's interior was still burning, the heat visible as waves in the air. "Jesus," Harrison said, staring into the firing slit. Klages said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had just killed at least 3 men in a manner that left no room for survival, no chance of surrender, no possibility of anything but immediate death or marginally delayed death from burns and smoke inhalation. It was efficient, it was necessary, and it was going to be his job for as long as he survived on this island. By February 23rd, when Yamamoto witnessed his first flamethrower attack, the weapon had already destroyed over 100 defensive positions on Iwo Jima. American commanders, initially skeptical of allocating resources to specialized flame units, now requested them specifically for every major assault. The Marines developed new tactics built around flamethrower capabilities. Infantry squads would suppress a bunker with rifle fire while the flame operator maneuvered into position. Once fire was poured into the position, demolition teams would move up to collapse the entrance and seal any surviving defenders inside. The process was systematic, methodical, and devastating. Japanese defensive doctrine had no counter to this weapon. Every principle of fortified defense assumed that interior positions provided safety. Depth meant survival. Concrete meant protection. But the flamethrower bypassed these assumptions by not trying to destroy the fortification. It simply filled the interior space with fire and waited for the occupants to die. A bunker that could withstand a 500-pound bomb became a death trap when a stream of jellied gasoline flowed through its entrance. Yamamoto's bunker received its turn on February 24th. The attack came in the late afternoon, when shadows from Mount Suribachi stretched across the volcanic sand and made visibility difficult. His squad had been reinforced that morning with 2 soldiers from a position overrun the previous day. The new men brought stories that contradicted everything Yamamoto had been taught about defensive warfare. They spoke of bunkers that had held for days against conventional attacks, only to be cleared in minutes by Americans wielding fire weapons. They described the sound the napalm made when it ignited. Not an explosion, but a roar, like a massive predator announcing its presence. And they described what happened to men who breathed the superheated air inside a burning bunker, even if the flames never touched them directly. "The lungs cook from the inside," one of them said, his voice flat with the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much too quickly. "You breathe in and the heat sears everything." Some men died still holding their rifles, no visible burns, just dead from the air itself. The squad leader, a corporal named Tanaka, ordered the man to be silent. "Fear is more dangerous than their weapons," Tanaka said. "This position has held for 5 days. The walls are solid. The entrance is protected. We follow our training, and we survive." But Yamamoto noticed that Tanaka kept glancing at the bunker's entrance, calculating angles, estimating distances. The corporal was doing the same mental mathematics that Yamamoto himself had been doing since witnessing the flamethrower attack the previous day. The entrance passage was angled at 45 degrees, designed to deflect shrapnel and block direct fire. But fire that could flow like liquid would follow that angle inward rather than deflecting away. The passage was 12 feet long enough to prevent grenade penetration, but not long enough to prevent flame penetration if the weapon's range was truly over 100 feet. And the bunker's interior space, which had seemed comfortably large during construction, now felt like a trap waiting to be sealed. The Americans came at 1600 hours, using the same tactics Yamamoto had observed being used against other positions. A rifle squad established a base of fire, suppressing the bunker's vision slits with concentrated volleys. Yamamoto could hear bullets striking concrete, a steady percussion that made visibility through the firing slit impossible. Under cover of this fire, other Marines maneuvered closer, using craters and destroyed equipment as cover. Then the rifle fire stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, Yamamoto heard the mechanical roar he now recognized. He pressed himself against the back wall of the bunker, furthest from the entrance. His squadmates did the same, an instinctive reaction that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the primitive human fear of fire. Tanaka alone remained near the entrance, his rifle pointed at the passage, as if bullets could somehow stop what was coming. The napalm stream entered the bunker like something alive, a bright orange entity that defied physics and common sense. It hit the angle in the entrance passage and followed the turn, maintaining coherence, flowing along the walls and ceiling. The temperature in the bunker rose instantly. Yamamoto felt it on his exposed skin, a searing heat that made him gasp. The gasp was a mistake. The air he inhaled was superheated, hot enough to hurt his throat and lungs. Tanaka fired 3 shots down the entrance passage, a futile gesture of defiance. And then the flame found him. The napalm struck his uniform and adhered, burning with an intensity that turned fabric and flesh into fuel. He screamed once, a sound that was more surprise than pain, and then fell forward into the entrance passage. The fire continued burning at the bunker entrance, a curtain of flame that blocked escape and illuminated the interior with hellish orange light. The air became unbreathable. Yamamoto's eyes watered from smoke and heat. He could see his remaining squadmates pressing against the far wall, their faces reflecting the same calculation. Stay and die from heat and smoke, or run through the flames and die from burns and bullets. One of the soldiers from the reinforced position made the decision for all of them. He bolted for the rear exit, a small opening that connected to the tunnel network. 2 others followed immediately. Yamamoto hesitated for perhaps 2 seconds, watching Tanaka's body burn, and then survival instinct overrode everything else. He ran. The rear tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to move through crouching. Yamamoto could hear the others ahead of him, gasping and coughing. The tunnel led to a larger passage that connected multiple positions, part of the vast underground network that was supposed to make the Japanese garrison invincible. But now the tunnels felt like tombs waiting to be filled. If the Americans could force soldiers out of their primary positions, the entire defensive network collapsed. Men who fled into the tunnels became refugees in their own fortifications, cut off from supplies and communications, hunted through passageways that offered no room to maneuver or fight effectively. Yamamoto emerged from the tunnel into a larger chamber that served as a secondary command post. Approximately 20 soldiers had gathered there, refugees from other overrun positions. An officer, a lieutenant whose uniform was torn and blackened, was attempting to restore order and reorganize the survivors into functional units. But the men's faces told the story more clearly than any tactical assessment. These were soldiers who had been taught that their defensive positions were impregnable, who had been promised that underground fortifications would neutralize American advantages in firepower and machines. And they had just learned that every promise was a lie. "The bunkers are useless," one soldier said, his voice carrying the flat affect of shock. "The fire goes around corners. It fills the space. Concrete doesn't matter. Depth doesn't matter." "Silence!" the lieutenant snapped. But the officer's authority rang hollow. He had no answer to the tactical problem the flamethrower represented. Japanese doctrine had no contingency for a weapon that turned fortifications into liabilities. The training manuals described how to defend against tanks, artillery, infantry assault, naval bombardment. There was no chapter on defending against liquid fire that flowed through your defenses and cooked you alive in the positions you had spent months constructing. Over the next 3 days, the pattern repeated across Iwo Jima. American forces would locate a Japanese position, often by drawing fire and marking the origin point. Infantry would suppress the position while flamethrower operators maneuvered into range. The napalm stream would enter the fortification, and defenders would face the choice between burning alive or fleeing into the open where rifles and machine guns waited. Most chose to flee. Some chose to burn. The result was the same. By February 27th, Yamamoto's unit had been reduced from 37 men to 11. They occupied a series of connected caves on the island's northern end, constantly moving to avoid being trapped in any single position. Food was scarce. Supply lines had been cut on the first day of the invasion. Water was rationed to 1 canteen per day. Medical supplies were non-existent. But worse than the physical deprivation was the psychological erosion. These men had been promised that their fortifications would protect them, that going underground was the path to survival. Instead, the underground positions had become death traps, and the Americans had developed the perfect weapon to exploit them. The flamethrower operators, for their part, had become specialists in a form of warfare that was both technically demanding and psychologically exhausting. Richard Klages, the Marine who had destroyed his first bunker on February 21st, had by February 27th cleared over 40 Japanese positions. The work followed a rhythm. Identify the target, suppress with supporting fire, approach within range, deliver flame, confirm the kill. Sometimes defenders fled and were cut down by infantry. Sometimes they stayed and burned. Sometimes they attempted to surrender, hands raised, uniforms smoking, and Klages had to make split-second decisions about whether they were genuinely surrendering or drawing Marines into range of grenades or explosives. The weapon took a toll on its operators in ways that had nothing to do with enemy fire. The fuel tanks had to be refilled after each extended engagement, a process that required returning to supply points and manually pumping napalm mixture into the cylinders. The tanks leaked occasionally, dripping fuel onto the operator's uniform, creating a constant awareness that a single spark could turn him into a casualty. The ignition system sometimes failed to light properly, requiring the operator to stand exposed while attempting to restart the pilot flame. And there was the simple, brutal fact of what the weapon did to human beings, something that no amount of training could fully prepare a man. To witness and inflict repeatedly, Klages dealt with it by focusing on the tactical reality. Every bunker he destroyed was one fewer position that could kill his fellow Marines. Every Japanese soldier burned to death or forced into the open was one fewer enemy combatant who could contest the island's capture. The flamethrower was horrible, but it was effective in a way that no other weapon could match. A rifle squad might take an hour and suffer multiple casualties clearing a single fortified position. Klages could accomplish the same task in less than a minute with minimal risk to his supporting infantry. The Japanese garrison command recognized the crisis but had no solution. On March 1st, Major General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the Iwo Jima defenses, issued orders acknowledging that fixed fortifications could no longer be held against flamethrower attacks. He ordered remaining units to adopt mobile defense tactics, using caves and tunnels for concealment, but avoiding prolonged defense of any single position. The new doctrine emphasized night raids and infiltration attacks, tactics that negated the flamethrowers' advantages by ensuring combat occurred at close quarters, where the weapon's bulk and limited ammunition made it a liability rather than an asset. But the change in tactics came too late to alter the battle's outcome. American forces had secured the southern portion of the island, including the critical airfield, by the end of February. The raising of the American flag on Mount Suribati on February 23rd had provided a symbolic victory, but the real fighting continued in the island's northern region, where Japanese defenders used every cave and crevice as a fighting position. Flamethrower units cleared these positions methodically, sometimes advancing only 50 yards per day against determined resistance. Yamamoto's war ended on March 8, 1945. His group of 11 survivors had been trapped in a cave complex for 2 days, surrounded by American forces and cut off from any possibility of retreat or relief. Food was gone, water was gone, ammunition was nearly exhausted. The lieutenant who had led them from the overrun command post was dead, killed by shrapnel from a grenade that had bounced into their position. The senior surviving soldier, a private first class named Sato, gathered the remaining men and presented their options. "We can die here," Sato said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We can attempt to break through their lines tonight, or we can surrender." The word hung in the air like something toxic. Surrender was not part of Japanese military doctrine. Soldiers were expected to fight to the death or commit suicide rather than accept capture. To suggest surrender was to acknowledge the fundamental collapse not just of this unit, but of the entire belief system that had brought them to this island. And yet Yamamoto found himself considering it seriously for the first time. What was the point of dying here in a volcanic cave for an island that was already lost? What principle was worth defending when all the tactical principles they had been taught had proven false? Before anyone could respond to Sato's question, they heard the sound. The mechanical roar, the liquid rushing, the distinctive signature of the flamethrower. Someone had told the Americans where they were hiding, or perhaps the Marines had simply worked their way through every possible position in this section of the island. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they had perhaps 30 seconds before fire filled their cave. "Out the back tunnel," Sato ordered. "Move now." They fled deeper into the cave system, 10 men stumbling through darkness, their hands touching rough volcanic rock for guidance. Behind them, the cave entrance glowed orange, and the temperature rose even at a distance of 50 feet. They could hear the fire burning, consuming what little oxygen remained in the confined space. The rear tunnel branched in 3 directions. Sato chose the middle path because it angled upward, away from the fire, and hopefully toward an exit that had not yet been discovered. They emerged into daylight near the island's northwestern coast, in an area that the Americans had declared secured 3 days earlier. There were no prepared positions, no cover, nowhere to run. 200 yards away, a group of Marines were establishing a supply depot, stacking ammunition crates and fuel drums in a cleared area. The Marines spotted the Japanese soldiers immediately and raised their weapons. Sato raised his hands. One by one, the others did the same. Yamamoto was the last to comply, his hand still touching his rifle sling. Decades of training insisting that this was wrong, this was betrayal, this was unthinkable. Then he thought about the bunker that was supposed to be impregnable, the flames that flowed around corners, the promises that had proven to be lies built on tactical assumptions that no longer applied. He raised his hands. The Marines approached cautiously, weapons ready, clearly expecting a trick or a final desperate attack. But Yamamoto and his 9 surviving squad mates simply stood there, hands raised, too exhausted and psychologically broken to contemplate further resistance. They were searched for weapons, bound with wire, and herded into a temporary holding area near the beach where other prisoners were being collected. It was there, in the prisoner compound, that Yamamoto finally understood the full scope of what had happened. The compound held over 200 Japanese prisoners, an unprecedented number for a Pacific battle where surrender was supposed to be non-existent. These men, like Yamamoto himself, had been soldiers who believed in their fortifications, who trusted their training, who had been promised that defensive depth would counter American material superiority. And they had all learned the same lesson. Promises mean nothing when your enemy develops a weapon that turns your defenses into death traps. The guards at the prisoner compound were Marines from a reserve battalion, men who had not participated in the initial assault, but had been brought ashore to handle logistics and security as the front lines moved north. One of them, a corporal from Wisconsin named Miller, spoke some Japanese learned from a missionary grandfather. He attempted to communicate with the prisoners, partly from duty and partly from genuine curiosity about what had caused so many Japanese soldiers to surrender when surrender was supposed to be impossible. "Why did you give up?" Miller asked Yamamoto through halting Japanese during the evening meal distribution on March 9th. The food was American rations, canned meat and crackers, far more substantial than anything Yamamoto had eaten in the past week. Yamamoto considered the question while he ate. The simple answer was that resistance had become impossible. But the deeper answer, the one that explained why 200 men had violated every principle of their military culture, was more complex. He tried to articulate it in simple Japanese that Miller might understand. "Your fire weapon," Yamamoto said. "It makes the bunkers into ovens. We were told to go underground to survive, but underground became the most dangerous place." Miller nodded slowly, processing the words. "The flamethrowers," he said in English, then switched back to Japanese. "Yes, they are effective." Effective. Such a clinical word for what Yamamoto had experienced. The word did not capture the psychological impact of watching defensive positions that were supposed to be impregnable get neutralized in seconds. It did not convey the terror of being trapped in a concrete box while liquid fire flowed toward you, offering only the choice between burning alive or fleeing into gunfire. It did not describe the fundamental collapse of belief that occurred when every tactical principle you had been taught proved worthless against a weapon your instructors had never imagined. Over the next several days, as American forces completed their conquest of Iwo Jima, Yamamoto had time to reflect on the battle from the perspective of survival rather than immediate combat. The prisoner compound expanded to hold over 300 Japanese soldiers and sailors, a number that would have been inconceivable in earlier Pacific battles. On Tarawa, fewer than 20 Japanese prisoners had been taken from a garrison of over 4,000. On Saipan, fewer than 1,000 prisoners from a garrison of 30,000. The difference on Iwo Jima was not that Japanese soldiers had become less committed or more willing to surrender. The difference was the flamethrower. The weapon had broken the mathematical logic of fortified defense. In earlier battles, Japanese soldiers could calculate survival probability and conclude that defending a hardened position offered better odds than fleeing into open ground. But the flamethrower made this calculation impossible. There was no survival probability inside a bunker that could be filled with fire. The only rational choice was to flee or surrender, and once that choice was made by a few soldiers, it became psychologically easier for others to make the same choice. American military analysts would later estimate that flamethrower units on Iwo Jima destroyed over 800 fortified positions and were directly responsible for over 40% of Japanese combat deaths on the island. These numbers, however, did not capture the weapon's psychological impact. For every position destroyed by flame, dozens of other positions were abandoned by defenders who had witnessed flamethrower attacks and understood that staying meant certain death. The weapon's reputation preceded it, creating a psychological pressure that was as effective as its physical application. The battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945. Although isolated pockets of resistance continued for months afterward, American casualties totaled over 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed. The only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. But those numbers obscured the tactical revolution that had occurred. The Japanese defensive doctrine that had inflicted such horrific losses on earlier invasions had been countered by a weapon that negated the advantages of fortification. The lessons learned on Iwo Jima would be applied to the invasion of Okinawa 2 weeks later, where flamethrower units were deployed in even greater numbers against even more extensive defensive positions. For Richard Klages, the Marine flamethrower operator who had destroyed his first bunker on February 21st, the battle ended with survivors' guilt that would last decades. He had cleared over 60 Japanese positions during his time on Iwo Jima, had personally killed or caused the death of hundreds of enemy soldiers, and had emerged without a scratch despite carrying a weapon that made him a priority target. In letters home written after the battle, he described the flamethrower as the weapon that won Iwo Jima, but also as the weapon I wish had never been invented. The contradiction haunted him, the knowledge that the weapon had saved countless American lives by making Japanese positions untenable, balanced against the knowledge of what it did to human beings trapped in those positions. The development of napalm and its deployment in flamethrowers represented a turning point in military technology, one that emerged from the specific tactical challenge of Pacific Island warfare. The Japanese had bet their defensive strategy on fortification and depth, on the reasonable assumption that concrete and earth could protect soldiers from aerial bombardment and naval gunfire. The assumption was correct as far as it went, but it failed to account for American industrial and scientific capacity to develop entirely new weapons in response to tactical problems. Louis Fieser, the Harvard chemist who had developed the napalm formula, learned of its combat effectiveness on Iwo Jima through military reports that reached him in early March. His reaction, recorded in personal correspondence, was mixed. As a scientist, he was pleased that his work had proven effective and had contributed to American military success. As a human being, he was disturbed by detailed descriptions of what the weapon did to its victims. He would later write that he considered napalm to be the most effective and most terrible weapon of the war, a judgment that captured both its tactical value and its moral cost. The tactical lessons from Iwo Jima influenced American planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation that was scheduled for late 1945. Military planners anticipated that Japan's mountainous terrain and extensive urban areas would create defensive positions even more formidable than those encountered on Pacific Islands. Flamethrower production was increased. Napalm stockpiles were expanded. New tactics were developed for using flame weapons in urban environments, where buildings and basements could serve as ready-made fortifications. The entire operational concept for invading Japan assumed that flamethrowers would be the primary weapon for clearing defensive positions, with conventional weapons serving mainly to support flame operations. This planning became moot when atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, forcing Japan's surrender and eliminating the need for an invasion. But the flamethrowers' influence on military technology did not end with World War II. The weapon and its napalm fuel became standard equipment in subsequent conflicts, used extensively in Korea and Vietnam. The fundamental principle Fieser had discovered, that jellied gasoline could be projected over long distances and would stick to whatever it touched, proved applicable to aerial bombardment as well as ground combat. Napalm bombs became a standard weapon for close air support, dropping jellied fire onto targets that conventional bombs could not effectively engage. The psychological impact of napalm weapons generated controversy that intensified with each subsequent use.
Images of napalm victims from Vietnam created public opposition to the weapon that eventually led to restrictions on its use under international humanitarian law. The United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, adopted in 1980, included Protocol 3 specifically restricting the use of incendiary weapons against civilian populations or in areas where civilians might be affected. The protocol did not ban incendiary weapons entirely. Military necessity was acknowledged, but it represented a recognition that weapons like napalm occupied a morally ambiguous space between legitimate military tools and instruments
of unacceptable cruelty. For the Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with flamethrowers on Iwo Jima, the weapon remained a defining memory of the war. Yamamoto Kenji, who spent the remainder of World War II in a prisoner of war camp in Hawaii, returned to Japan in 1946 carrying psychological scars that never fully healed. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, he described the flamethrower as the weapon that ended our belief in defense. He explained that Japanese soldiers had been taught to trust in fortification, to believe that concrete and depth provided safety. The flamethrower had proven that safety was an illusion, that no position was truly defensible against an enemy willing and able to pour liquid fire through any opening. The broader military lesson from Iwo Jima was that defensive doctrine must account not just for existing weapons, but for the possibility of new weapons that change fundamental tactical assumptions. The Japanese had prepared for 1944's war, building fortifications designed to withstand the weapons Americans had used in previous campaigns. But American scientists and engineers had been working to develop weapons specifically designed to negate those fortifications. The result was a mismatch between defensive theory and offensive reality, one that cost thousands of Japanese soldiers their lives and forced hundreds more to choose surrender over certain death. The M22 flamethrower remained in U.S. military service until the 1970s, when it was finally replaced by lighter, more efficient models. But the tactical principle it established, that fortified positions could be neutralized with directed flame weapons, influenced military planning long after the specific hardware became obsolete. Modern militaries continue to develop thermobaric weapons that create similar effects through different mechanisms, using fuel-air explosives to generate intense heat and pressure in enclosed spaces. The technology has evolved, but the underlying concept remains. When enemies fortify themselves underground or in buildings, fire remains one of the most effective means of forcing them out or eliminating them in place. The strategic impact of the flamethrower extended beyond individual battles. The weapon's success on Iwo Jima and subsequent campaigns convinced Japanese military leadership that island defense was fundamentally unsustainable against American material superiority. This realization influenced the decision to focus remaining resources on defending the home islands, rather than attempting to hold outlying territories. In this sense, the flamethrower contributed not just to tactical victories, but to the broader strategic context that led to Japan's surrender. When Japanese leaders calculated their ability to resist an American invasion, they had to account for weapons that could neutralize their most heavily fortified positions. The calculation did not favor continued resistance. For the Marines who operated flamethrowers in combat, the experience left lasting effects that varied by individual. Some, like Richard Clagis, carried guilt about the deaths they had caused despite understanding the military necessity. Others processed the experience through different psychological frameworks, viewing their actions as justified by the circumstances and the alternative costs in American lives. Almost all described the weapon, with a mixture of respect for its effectiveness and revulsion at its effects. The flamethrower was the weapon that won battles, but it was also the weapon that forced operators to confront the most visceral and brutal aspects of combat. The historical irony of the flamethrower's development is that it emerged from a defensive problem, how to clear fortifications without excessive casualties, and became one of the war's most psychologically devastating offensive weapons. Louis Feezer had been asked to make gasoline sticky so it could be thrown farther. What he created was a substance that redefined the nature of infantry combat and forced a re-evaluation of defensive warfare. The napalm formula he developed in 1942 would remain classified for years after the war, but its effects were visible to anyone who witnessed its use or survived its application. Yamamoto Kenji died in 1997 at the age of 73. In his final years, he occasionally spoke with historians about his experiences on Iwo Jima, providing first-hand testimony about Japanese defensive preparations and the psychological impact of facing American flamethrowers. His descriptions were factual, detailed, and devoid of the propaganda that had characterized wartime accounts. He described the flamethrower as the weapon that taught us our fortifications meant nothing, and explained that the psychological collapse of Japanese defensive doctrine had broader implications than the loss of any single island. "We were told that going underground would save us," Yamamoto said in a 1992 interview. "We were told that the Americans could not dig us out. We were told that patience and fortification would overcome their machines and their numbers. But they did not need to dig us out. They simply filled our positions with fire. And we learned that all our preparation, all our concrete and tunnels, all our calculations about angles and thickness and depth, none of it mattered against a weapon that could flow like water and burn like the sun." The flamethrower's range of 150 feet, achieved through the thickening properties of napalm, was not an arbitrary specification. It was the distance that allowed operators to attack fortified positions from beyond the effective range of grenades and most small arms. It was the distance that turned defensive positions into death traps by allowing attackers to pour fire through openings without exposing themselves to defensive fire, and it was the distance that broke the mathematical logic of fortified warfare, proving that no defensive calculation could account for weapons specifically designed to negate those calculations. The terror that Japanese soldiers felt when facing flamethrowers was not irrational fear. It was the rational recognition that their defensive doctrine had been rendered obsolete by a weapon their training had never prepared them to counter. The bunkers that were supposed to protect them became ovens. The tunnels that were supposed to provide escape routes became channels for spreading fire. The depth that was supposed to provide safety became a trap that made escape impossible. Every principle of defensive warfare that had been proven in earlier battles failed against a weapon that operated on fundamentally different principles than conventional explosives. The legacy of napalm and the flamethrowers that deployed it remains controversial. The weapon undeniably saved American lives by reducing the time and casualties required to clear fortified positions. Military historians estimate that the invasion of Japan, had it occurred, would have cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese casualties. The flamethrower's effectiveness in neutralizing fortified positions was a significant factor in those calculations. By making Japanese defensive positions untenable, the weapon contributed to the strategic pressure that led to Japan's surrender without invasion. But the weapon's effectiveness came at a moral cost that continues to generate debate. Napalm burns caused some of the most horrific injuries of the war. The weapon's indiscriminate nature, once ignited, napalm continued burning regardless of whether its victims were combatants or civilians, led to its later restriction under international law. The psychological impact on both victims and operators created trauma that lasted decades beyond the war's end. The flamethrower was effective precisely because it was terrible, and its effectiveness raised questions about the limits of acceptable weapons in warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.